In Mormonism, the endowment, second anointing, and sealing ordinances are crucial to the foundations of the entire religion. However, their exact origins are shrouded in mystery. There is an eternal debate that seems to never be solved as to whether these ordinances were an invention of Joseph or Brigham. However, if we actually look, then there is ample evidence to suggest that Joseph was up to something in the years prior to his death. For context, it is helpful to actually understand what the Anointed Quorum is purported to be. The quorum itself was called by a few different names, such as the Council, the Quorum of the Anointed, the Holy Order, or the Anointed Quorum. Each person seemed to have preferred a specific name for the group. For instance, Heber C. Kimball used the term Holy Order, William Clayton used Quorum of the Priesthood, and Joseph's journal often just simply recorded prayer meeting. It was different for each person, but the details seemed to all be remarkably accurate across all the records. The actual quorum itself was a small group of individuals that Joseph was said to have first introduced the temple ordinances that we know of today. We don't have many specifics about the ordinances administered in the group. However, we do know that the group occasionally met in special clothing, and when Brigham administered the ordinances in the Nauvoo Temple, and then later in the Endowment House, no one actually spoke about any differences. It would, of course, be natural for someone to have raised objections if the differences were substantial, or if Joseph never even introduced the ordinances at all. The quorum initially met in the upper room of the Red Brick Store and at various times in a few private residences, such as Brigham's house. Membership in the group was limited to a few specific key individuals who often personally wrote that they felt very special to be admitted to the exclusive group. The ordinances given in the group were washing, anointing, endowment, sealings, and the second anointing, all of which are still practiced today in the LDS temples. In addition, there was extensive overlap between the Anointed Quorum and the Council of 50. According to records, leaders and their wives were initiated into the group, which they felt was a reward for their dedication to Joseph and the church. After the death of Joseph, the Anointed Quorum continued to meet and admit new members. However, the group quickly became obsolete when Brigham started to administer the ordinances to all the church members in the Nauvoo area prior to the departure to Utah. This was recorded to be over 5,000 people. At this point, the ordinances were no longer limited to a few key individuals, and so secrecy was now no longer important. In looking at the Anointed Quorum, there is an abundance of journal accounts, diary entries, and written statements to consider. These have been compiled into a book called Joseph Smith's Quorum of the Anointed, which I would highly recommend if you were interested. There is a paper as well, which was published by the same author in the Journal of Mormon History. Of course, the journal accounts before Joseph's death and before the Utah era should take precedence. However, if someone wants to conclude that anything that disagrees with them is fraudulent, there is very little that can be done about that. Yes, there could be a grand conspiracy. However, if the evidence to support a conclusion is declaring all contradictory evidence as invalid, then maybe we might want to rethink the conclusion. I'm not sure the best way to present the statements, and it doesn't seem helpful to comment about each one. For research purposes, I feel it might be helpful to just include them directly and people can feel free to use them as they see fit. There is also a link in the description to the blog with all the quotes and links to all the sources. It is also important to point out that this is a very small sampling of all the records that we have available. I decided to stop in 1844, however, there is an abundance of information in 1845 as well. This is why they were compiled into book form, because there is simply just an enormous amount of information available. On May 1, 1842, this statement shows that Joseph was starting to think of temple rites and the need to administer them to the church. According to Joseph, there was something unique that needed to happen in order for a person to know God. And according to D&C 124, some things belonged to the temple, but could be administered outside of the temple if one was not available. May 4, 1842. These statements from Joseph and Heber show that something pertaining to the priesthood happened on the 4th in the company of several individuals. Joseph's account is light on details. However, Heber's shows that he was initiated into a group that he called the Ancient Order and was washed, anointed, and then sealed. The list of individuals between both accounts is identical, so it seems these were two different descriptions of the same event. May 5, 1842. In these accounts, we can see that Joseph and Hiram continued with the same activity they were doing the previous day. However, it seems something was different about this specifically. In these records, it indicates that Joseph and Hiram were administered the same ordinances that they had administered the day previous. Joseph's journal seems to always hint about things, however, never saying it specifically. This would be understandable for a secret group that shouldn't be widely known. The history of the church and Brigham's account are later sources, however, they align perfectly with Joseph's account and the rest of the accounts. Therefore, it seems they are accurate. June 17, 1842. In this letter, Heber is writing to Parley concerning something which he described as precious. He goes on to describe a similarity between Freemasonry and the priesthood that Joseph introduced. This letter also makes perfect sense because just a month earlier, Heber had been initiated into the Anointed Quorum while Parley was not. May 26, 1843. In these 1843 statements, according to Joseph's journal, a new and everlasting covenant is introduced, which seems to include the ordinance of endowment. William Clayton calls it the doctrine of priesthood. However, it seems to be an extension of what was introduced in 1842. The entire original group is present for this additional teaching on the priesthood and the new ordinance, which they called the endowment. May 28, 1843. In these accounts, we can see that most of the group from the 26th met again and now administered the endowment to Joseph and likely Hiram. This is similar to the 1842 accounts where Joseph and Hiram administered washing and anointing to most of this group, and then they subsequently met to administer the same to Joseph and Hiram. This same pattern is followed here. There is also shorthand notation indicating that Joseph and James Adams were sealed to their spouses. However, that is a separate discussion entirely. May 29, 1843. The next day, the group met again to initiate some of their spouses and to seal them as couples. The Anointed Quorum now consisted of the original insiders along with a few of their wives. Along with being initiated into the group, there was some additional teaching and discussion about the priesthood and how the ordinances were connected to the priesthood. September 28, 1843. The group met again, and it appears a few new people were initiated into the Anointed Quorum. Lyman, Woodworth, and Bernheisel were washed, anointed, and initiated into the secret group. It appears the group also attempted to formalize and choose Joseph as their president. He was already the de facto president before, but it was never formally accepted by the group. He was also anointed and ordained as president along with Emma, his wife. Emma is rarely mentioned in the records, so it is not clear how much of a role she actually played. October 1, 1843. The Anointed Quorum met again, and this time initiated additional wives into the group. Joseph was again chosen as president and anointed and ordained for that role, the same as he was on the 28th. It appears William Law, his counselor in the first presidency, was also anointed and chosen as a president, according to the record. William Law, however, would very quickly lose favor with Joseph and no longer be invited to any of the meetings. October 22, 1843. The Anointed Quorum met again, and this time William Marks' wife was initiated into the group. According to the records, William Marks himself was ordained to be a prophet, priest, and king, similar to what Joseph was ordained to. October 27, 1843. The Anointed Quorum met again, and this time initiated Newell K. Whitney's wife into the group. For the wives, it is not always clear the specific ordinances administered or how much they personally understood about the group. It does seem to make sense, though, that they would have a bunch of questions for their husbands once they understood what was happening. October 29, 1843. These accounts show that additional wives were initiated into the Anointed Quorum. This time it was sisters Cutler, Cahoon, and Woodworth. November 1, 1843. This time the Anointed Quorum met to initiate sisters Richards, Taylor, Young, and Kimball. It seems Emma was the one to wash and anoint the sisters. In a separate account, it was written that the individuals would be fully nude and then washed from head to toe in preparation for the ordinances. November 5, 1843. The Anointed Quorum met again for a general meeting. Not much is known about this specific meeting. However, it is interesting because it mentions Joseph didn't wear the customary robes during the meeting. This is likely because Joseph mentioned he had gotten violently sick earlier in the day and still did not feel well. November 12, 1843. These accounts mention that now Reynolds Cahoon and his wife were anointed. This is likely a mention to the second anointing, since both had already been initiated into the group and received their previous ordinances. November 22, 1843. These accounts now mention that Brigham Young received his second anointing and was anointed as a prophet, priest, and king. It is interesting because the current wording to the second anointing ordinance also ordains the individual to the role of a prophet, priest, and king. The first anointing anoints them to this role, and the second anointing confirms the anointing, thus making it valid. December 2, 1843. The Anointed Quorum met again, this time to initiate additional individuals. This appears to be a case where certain individuals received the preparatory ordinances, such as washing, anointing, and endowment. Then they were given the second anointing, which in Mormonism is the highest ordinance you can receive. December 9, 1843. This time the Anointed Quorum met again to initiate Phelps, Richards, Lott, and Joseph Fielding, and administer the endowment along with the other ordinances. It is unclear as to why certain individuals were initiated much earlier than other individuals. December 17, 1843. These accounts mention that Samuel Harris Smith was initiated into the group and received his first anointing, which would be washing, anointing, along with the endowment ceremony. December 23, 1843. In these records, it is mentioned that several new individuals were initiated into the group and received their endowment. These were primarily the wives of those who were initiated previously. However, new individuals were added to the group with their wives soon to follow. In a later account, Bathsheba Smith confirms that Joseph felt Freemasonry was an altered version of the true priesthood order. January 7, 1844. The Anointed Quorum met again. However, this time William Law is specifically mentioned as being absent. This is in contrast to William Marks, who was marked as simply not present. William Law attended a dinner party with Joseph on October 11, 1843, and then after that point, he is either absent from the records or mentioned negatively. On January 3, 1844, it was mentioned that William Law felt that Joseph was trying to kill him. Just a few months after this, William Law swore an affidavit to Joseph's involvement in adultery and fornication. January 20, 1844. These accounts mention that now Heber and his wife were given the second anointing and made prophets, priests, or priestesses, and kings or queens, respectively. January 21, 1844. In these accounts, it is mentioned that now Parley P. Pratt was given his second anointing. There was also mention of Parley needing a wife sealed to him, otherwise he would not attain to his full spiritual glory. At that time, he was married, but his wife was not sealed to him yet. She eventually would be in 1846. January 22, 1844. The Anointed Quorum met again, and it seems William Clayton was admitted into the group. William wrote in his personal diary that he was incredibly excited to be admitted and felt that it was a supreme blessing from God. January 25, 1844. These accounts mention that now Orson Hyde received his second anointing. They also mention that now that William Clayton was a member of the group, that he needed his robe and garment, which would be needed for the endowment and other ordinances. We don't have specifics about what those robe and garment actually looked like, but it is very interesting how similar it is to LDS temple ordinances today. January 26, 1844, the Anointed Quorum met again, and this time Orson Pratt was given his second anointing. January 27, 1844, these accounts mention that since Willard Richards and Janetta Richards had been sick, then they hadn't been able to meet for a while. However, now they could meet together and were sealed and received their second anointing. January 28, 1844, the Anointed Quorum met again, this time to seal Wilford Woodruff to his wife and give them their second anointing. A much later account from Wilford Woodruff confirms the details of his earlier account. January 30, 1844, this time the Anointed Quorum met to seal John Taylor to his wife Leonora and then to administer the second anointing ordinance. Both had received their first anointing or endowment in late 1843. January 31, 1844. These accounts mention that the Anointed Quorum met to seal George Smith to his wife Bathsheba and to administer the second anointing ordinance. February 2, 1844. These accounts mention that now it was William Phelps and his wife Sally's turn to be sealed and receive their second anointing. William and Sally had both received their previous ordinances in late 1843. February 3rd, 1844. These accounts mentioned that William Clayton finally received his first anointing and endowment. He had been accepted into the Anointed Quorum about a week earlier and had his endowment clothing specially made for this purpose. The account also mentions how grateful William felt and how much of an honor he thought it was to be administered these ordinances. These accounts are also noteworthy because Joseph was not present and Brigham was now starting to administer the ordinances to others. February 4, 1844. The Anointed Quorum met again, this time to administer the ordinances to Cornelius Lot and his wife Permelia. There were some remarks about the 144,000 from the book of Revelation. Joseph is said to have remarked that the 144,000 were currently being chosen. February 26, 1844. The Anointed Quorum met again, this time to seal and administer the second anointing to John Smith and his wife Clarissa, and Isaac Morley and his wife Lucy. Both had received their first anointing and endowment in late 1843. August 9, 1844. According to the records, there was a somewhat large gap between any kind of mentions of the Anointed Quorum. This is likely because internal and external conflicts were increasing, and there just wasn't as much need anymore, that numerous people had now received their first and second anointings. Joseph also was under extreme pressure with his May 23rd indictment for adultery and fornication. Couple this with the pressure and open hostility from people like William Law, and it is understandable there was a lack of formal meetings. In this record, however, it is mentioned that the quorum met and decided to no longer admit individuals. At that time, Joseph had been dead for about a month, and the future of the church was quite uncertain. The group, however, does admit individuals later, once things are more certain. August 15, 1844. In these records, it mentions that some members of the Anointed Quorum, including men and women, met for prayer pertaining to the current afflictions that they were facing in the church. It is unclear if they met and prayed in their ceremonial robes or not. According to previous records, they would, however, meet to pray in the robes occasionally. September 4, 1844. These records mention that the Anointed Quorum met again to pray for the preservation of the church and to curse their enemies. At that time, the church was still facing significant external pressure along with legal challenges concerning the Nauvoo city charter. Brigham had begun to plan the westward migration and knew that it was an inevitability. October 1, 1844. In his brief record, Heber mentions that the Anointed Quorum, or the Holy Order, as he called it, met for prayer. December 22, 1844. In this last account of 1844, it is mentioned that a few wives were accepted into the Anointed Quorum and administered their first anointings. William Clayton mentioned that there was some urgent need for secrecy, which could be part of the reason they met so infrequently. In another account, it is mentioned that they constantly were in fear of mob attacks, and so were always on guard. It would certainly be a trying time for the church. As mentioned, I decided to stop including the statements as of 1844. However, there is simply an abundance of information in 1845 as well. Without a doubt, it seems Joseph initiated several people into a highly specific group, which administered ordinances to each other. This group consisted of several key insiders along with trusted members, and seemed to be a way for Joseph to work out the kinks in administering the ordinances to others. It is one thing to envision the ordinances in your mind, and completely another thing to administer to them to others and practice it as a group. This concept also makes perfect sense when you actually think about it. It would be strange for Joseph to not have essentially done a trial run with the insiders as the ordinances were taking shape. There is so much involved in a ritual like this that you can't just create it out of thin air and then expect it to go smoothly as you administer it to others. In addition, it also likely helped Joseph to become more familiar and comfortable with the ordinances themselves. As additional people accepted it as a valid ordinance from God, then that is exactly what it became to them. Collectively, people accept things that individually they would never accept. Of course, we don't know specifically what the differences were between the modern temple ordinances and the ones that were practiced in 1842 and onwards. From the accounts, it seems that the Anointed Quorum first met to administer washing and anointing, then endowments, then sealings, and then second anointings. This is quite similar to what happens in the LDS temples today. The accounts also mention the group wore special clothing met for these ordinances in special occasions, and even wore this special clothing for prayer. This sounds very similar to the modern temple practices in the LDS Church. It would, however, be very strange to suggest there were wild differences between the two. This is simply because the numerous people who were initiated into the Anointed Quorum, who also had no objections at all in Nauvoo and then in Utah, as the ordinances were practiced church-wide. In addition, we have people like Alpheus Cutler, who joined the Anointed Quorum in December 1843 and didn't follow Brigham, however still continued to practice an endowment-type ordinance among his group. It would be very strange to think he copied the endowment from Brigham when he didn't accept him as the rightful leader. It is hard to say what Joseph's motivations were with these ordinances and whether he felt they were needed to obtain a correct standing before God. However, it does seem like Joseph felt a certain amount of ritual was a key aspect of the worship of God. Joseph seemed to also be enamored with the ritual aspects of Freemasonry and wanted to incorporate some of those into Mormonism. Ritual has always been a key aspect of Judaism and then Christianity as it developed. These rituals can serve to help focus thoughts and attitudes on God and his works. However, they can also be a hindrance, as we can easily lose sight of the purpose of the ritual and instead focus on the ritual itself. In many ways, this is inevitable due to human nature. As things become more common, then they can lose whatever inherent value they once possessed, and instead be seen completely different than they once were. The once treasured possession can instead become the mundane afterthought. As always, thanks for figuring things out with me.